Hello, everyone. This is F. Paul Driscoll with another episode of Opera News's Sightlines. And my guest today is my very good friend, Dame Jane Glover. Jane, welcome. And thank you very much for joining us from Chicago, where you are now performing with Music of the Baroque, I believe.
I am.
You've been music director there since 2002.
20 years, amazing, yes.
I won't go into every place you've worked. I think that if I were going to go a list of theaters you haven't worked, it would be very short because it seems pretty much every place that's worth being, you've been there. But this season has included, among other things, your debut at CSO in Chicago and a return to the Met for Magic Flute, which I saw and was as wonderful as I remembered the last time I heard you do it. So welcome and thank you for making the time.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
So you spent a great deal of your professional life with Mozart. Are you still learning new things from that genius?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And aren't I lucky? I think barely a week goes by, actually, that I don't have some piece of his running through my head and my hands and therefore my heart. Mm-hmm. And I feel in some way charged by him in that sense. You know, he's just a constant presence. And in fact, as I say that, I look at my desk here in the hotel in Chicago, which has got notes for the book that I'm trying to finish about him. So he never leaves me. I was doing Mozart last week in Montreal. I'm doing some Mozart this week in Chicago. And as I say, he's a constant presence. And as you say, so perceptively, yeah, he's always teaching you new things. I mean, however much you do, I mean, how many magic flutes have I done? How many 40th symphonies have I done? And yet it's never the same. And you can never think, oh, I know how this goes, and just do it again. And you don't just fax it in, as we used to say. It's rather dates us to say things like that, I suppose. But he's just always challenging you to find something new and something you've never done before. Of course, a lot depends on the circumstances, the people you're working with, the size of the orchestra you're working with, the hall you're working with, whether or not you have an audience. Mm-hmm. You know, that might be whether you're recording it or whether you're doing it in a time of a pandemic where you're not allowed audiences at all and you bow to empty halls as you stream your concert and all that sort of thing. So that every time you do it, there is something new, and therefore one's always on one's toes with him.
When we hear Mozart today at someplace like the Metropolitan Opera or Lyric Opera Chicago, say the operas, the circumstances, the halls are indeed very different in size. How does that change the impact of the music, in your opinion? I mean, obviously we can't go back to his lifetime and listen to it, but do you prefer it in a smaller hall, or does doing it in a bigger hall have its own virtues?
You know, you can't generalize even about big halls and small halls, because some big halls have amazing acoustics and some small halls have terrible acoustics, and you know, it depends entirely on the individual hall. I mean, what's remarkable even about the Metropolitan Opera, and which of course is one of the biggest halls one can think of, and yet one doesn't have to amplify the dialogue. Mm-hmm. And that's a remarkable thing to me, that people can speak. They have to project, of course, on stage, but we don't have to give them microphones, and that's amazing. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you know, often in smaller theatres, it's necessary to give people microphones for dialogue and so on. In terms of intimacy, of impact of some of the Mozart operas, of course, you know, the themes are big, but often the contexts are small, are intimate, you know, a love duet or a seduction in the
Mhm.
case of Don Giovanni, or you know, just a moment of tenderness where you do want the audience to be right there, sort of smelling it. Um, and and some of these big theatres one's been in, you know, you go to the top of the gods and you look down and it's as if you're looking through the wrong end of a telescope and you think, what sort of subtlety on stage is going to be noticed from here? Um, but, you know, the rewards, on the other hand, are that always the sound is fantastic up there. And if you might miss the odd facial expression, but you'll get a wonderful balance, and so on and so forth. So there are good things and bad things about big halls and small halls. And the point is our task is to make the product live and breathe wherever we are.
How did he come into your life? At the relationship of you as a musician, when did that to him? When did that start?
Well, I suppose very early. I mean, I don't come from a professional musical family at all. But my family always liked music, and I remember when I was about 7 or 8, my father got his first long playing gramophone records, and the very first record he got was Dennis Brain playing the Mozart horn concertos. And since it was the only record we had for a while, you know, we just played it again and again. Well, I now know that I've known those Mozart horn concertos note for note since I was about 8 years old. And indeed, whenever I perform them these days, I can practically smell the vinyl. Do you know what I mean? This one
Yes, exactly.
took the thing out of the case. And well, one thing led to another, really. When I started to play, but well, I was playing the piano by then, but you know, as a child, one can master Mozart sonatas reasonably easily. You know what the great Schnabel said about Mozart, playing Mozart piano music, is that it's too easy for children and too difficult for grown-ups. And God, that's so profound and so right. But that means you can get your fingers around it and live in it a little bit, even as a small thing. And then, you know, just playing and singing through my teens, and he was just always there until I realized it was and it was the first opera I conducted. Was The Marriage of Figaro when I was an undergraduate, believe it or not. I was 21 years old. I mean, God knows what it sounded like. But I learned so much doing that in my final year at Oxford. And I always maintain that although it was utterly off curriculum, it wasn't part of the course at all. But we put huge amounts of energy into this production of Figaro. And I think that that taught me more than anything else that I learned in my 3 years as an undergraduate at university. Certainly in terms of what I've gone on to do since.
Was that performance of Figaro that when you decided that what you wanted to do was conduct, or was that not an option at that point for you? You were thinking of, I mean, because obviously you've worked as a musician, you've worked as an author, you're a very well-respected teacher, so you had lots and lots of options in front of you. And
oh, it didn't feel like that. It never does feel like that, does it? When you're an undergraduate. All I can tell you is that instinctively, when something felt sort of right, it was probably awful. I mean, it was probably awful. But on the other hand, I felt that by conducting, there was some sort of eloquence was communicated through physical gesture in relation to the music I was trying to serve. And that just, I don't ever remember thinking I'm going to be a conductor. But I think I certainly wanted to pursue doing it. And although that didn't happen for a while, because when I graduated, I did then a postgraduate, I did a doctorate at Oxford, which was also geared towards performance, which was on 17th century Venetian music, and particularly the operas of Cavalli, about whom I actually wrote a book in due course. But the point of my research for that doctorate, which meant that I spent 4 years divided between Venice and Oxford. Not bad, eh?
No, not bad at all.
The point of that was not just to write about the pieces I was taking off the shelf and reading, but actually what I really did was make performing editions of them and perform them, which, and over the course of the decades it now is since I started all that, I've done several of those Venetian operas and made performing editions of them and performed them. And now, of course, everybody's playing Cavalli, and Monteverdi, of course, has never been far from, was already part of people's repertoire then. But it was great to be part of that movement too.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about Mozart, either as a composer or as a man?
The biggest misconception. Well, an awful lot of people I know as a man are influenced by the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I make that point, Amadeus the movie was very different from Amadeus the play, which I thought was brilliant.
Yes.
Amadeus the play of Peter Shaffer was basically an essay about genius and mediocrity. And if you're going to write about the conflict between genius and mediocrity, then Mozart and Salieri, very good way of delivering that message. By the time it became that extraordinarily brilliant movie, it was presented as a biopic, and that this was therefore true, everything that happened, and it was full of error.
Yeah.
And it looked gorgeous. It sounded fantastic. There were some, not all, superb performances in the movie, but it told a whole load of whoppers, really, of lies, and not least the portrayal of Mozart as a sort of hyperactive, vulgar, never grown up kid. Mm-hmm. And even more, actually, I mind even more about the portrayal of Constanza, but we can come on to that, because I think Mozart sort of survived the Schaffer treatment. I mean, the Amadeus treatment. The person who didn't was Constanza, and we can perhaps come on to that because I tried to do something about that. But I think, of course, there was an element of wildness in Mozart, particularly as a young man, you know. And there are those famous 9 scatological letters that he wrote to his naughty cousin, mm-hmm. Who was a little bit younger than he was, when they were still teenagers, which are pretty filthy, and you sort of read them gulping a bit. But there are 9, and that's it. And you know, he grew out of that. He particularly grew out of that phase of sort of immature scatological humor. When he became certainly a husband, and more to the point, a father, when he assumed sort of normal responsibilities of husband and father, and actually, you know, there was a maturity and a gentleness in him always, in his life, which was overlaid by a sort of love of activity and excitement and fun, and yes, slightly filthy sort of sense of humor sometimes, but it's the overwhelming generosity of spirit that for me pours off the pages of his letters. I mean, that's where we learn so much about him, not just from his music, which teaches us a lot about him, but not always what exactly was going on in his life at the time. I mean, he was not at all an autobiographical composer. You cannot tell from the kind of music he's writing whether he's in a good mood or not, because somehow when he's writing music, he's always somewhere in a place where he is, in a sense, always in a good mood. It's an alternative universe for him to write music, regardless of what horrors are going on in his life in the real world. And I believe that this generosity that comes not just from the music, is also on the pages of his letters. You know, we have these fantastic number of letters that he wrote throughout his life. And from the beginning, there is a sunniness to his nature, which was sorely tested in adulthood as life threw more and more challenges at him. And yet there's an essential optimism. And I keep coming back to this word generosity of spirit about him. And that maybe is one of the things that just sort of drives one to return to the music again and again and again, is this, he just, you know, opens so many glorious doors.
Could you talk about his wife, Constanza, a little bit? Because reading your book, that to me was the biggest lesson I learned, was how competent she was, and how clever she was, especially at the end of his life and immediately after.
Definitely afterwards, yes, but that's certainly not the impression, is it, that you're given either in the play or definitely not the movie of Amadeus, which is, as I say, has been so. Of course, it's been very helpful to spread the name of Mozart all over the world, but it's also been quite unhelpful in sort of telling the truth. But Constanza, yes, was portrayed as this sort of vulgar airhead who joined in these scatological games and was and had no merits at all, except that she offered to sleep with Salieri if it was going to get her husband a job. Well, A, that didn't happen, and B, she wasn't like that. She was, as you say, a very intelligent woman. She was also a fine musician. She was one of 4 sisters who, to me, are just fabulous, the whole foursome. They're like the Brontes, you know. The eldest sister was the first queen of the night. The second sister, Aloysia, was the Renee Fleming of her day, was the greatest singer on the planet. The third one was Constanza, who was also a fine musician and a good singer. We know that what her voice was like because of the music he wrote for her, namely the C minor mass. I mean, that's hard. And then the fourth sister, who was not singer, she acted a bit, but was basically the carer of the family, was Sophia. And these 4 sisters were very much part of his life, and in at various times, but particularly Aloysia and Constanza. And so she was very highly educated, actually better taught than Mozart had been himself. I mean, he was homeschooled, as we all know, and he'd had this incredible childhood, being all over Europe and just sort of picking up languages and history and literature and all that sort of thing, and geography, wherever he went. And you know, he was obviously a genius and could cope with anything in that educational way. But Constanza was properly educated and properly taught. And she was the one with the business sense, which, my God, Mozart did not have at all. He was completely hopeless with money. If he had it, he gave it away and spent it, but gave it away as well. And if he didn't have it, he did the same thing. He went on spending and giving it away. And he was just useless with it. Whereas, you know, somebody else I've written about, it was Handel. It's absolutely brilliant with money. You know, it played the stock market with great success, knew exactly when to buy and when to sell, and was trusted with money to buy singers and all that sort of thing. Mozart got into huge financial difficulties, as we all know, and it was only really in the last 18 months of Mozart's life, which of course nobody knew were going to be the last 18 months of his life, that Constanza, who'd been kept away from the sort of business side of life, because that's what, you know, men did, the husbands looked after the money. So when Constanza realized what trouble they were in, she sort of took hold of things and turned it all around, so that although 1790 had been a dreadful, and the year before had been dreadful years of poverty and begging, those terrible begging letters that Mozart wrote to his Freemason colleagues saying, can you lend me 10 of these or 1,000 of these, or, you know, anything just to help us get by. Constanza turned things around, and they were more or less secure, certainly because he had very good commissions in 1791 and was beginning to earn well again. Except that by then he was very ill and as we all know, died at the age of 35. At which point, Constanza, who had a 7-year-old and a tiny baby and no money, and she herself was only, did I just say this, 29? I mean, that's a tall order. And yet what she did have, of course, lying around the apartment was Mozart's manuscripts. And she managed to get those, to the benefit of all of us, published. And she drove a very hard bargain with publishers. She was a astute businesswoman. She wanted to get a biography written of him. Actually married the man in due course who wrote it. And actually, he didn't finish it either. He died before he finished that, which was a sort of double irony for her, that she married two men who died in the middle of writing big things. But she was great, and she was also very canny. I think, you know, there are wonderful stories of her being visited in old age. She outlived him by many years. Curiously, you know, somebody who'd been born in the reign of Maria Theresa. By the time she died, Queen Victoria was on the throne in England, and you know, you think, well, that's practically my grandparents' generation, you know,
Right,
were
exactly.
born in Victorian times. You know, it's just sort of brings it terribly close. So she was visited by many people and assumed a sort of dignity finally in her old age, and as the widow of who she was the widow of. And at last it sort of came right, but she had to struggle for it.
And as you mentioned, you wrote another wonderful book. Mozart's Women was the first one that I had read of yours, but also Handel in London, which is about the making of a genius. And Handel, to me, is somebody that when I was growing up, and up to and including perhaps when I was in college, it was in the United States, basically Messiah and Julius Caesar, if you lived in New York and knew the Beverly Hills, Julius Riddell kind of what mosaic of what the original intention was, the way that was all rearranged. But what was it that spurred such an incredible revival of interest in his operas that seems to be still ongoing now?
That's a good question. I think there are two things that happened towards, well, in the second half of the last century, but actually the fourth quarter, really, of the last century. One was the rise of the countertenor, and the other was the revival of period of historically informed instrumental music. You know, the right kind of instruments, the right kind of sound, therefore, from the right instruments, and the combination of that plus, you know, great countertenors who seemed to get higher and higher with more and more coloratura, could suddenly sing all these Handel roles that were written for castrati. And of course, women could sing them too, which they did in Handel's time as well. But I mean, now everybody's utterly gender fluid in casting, it seems to me. But I certainly grew up in a time when it's nice to have all the male roles sung by men and all the female roles sung by women. And so to have Julius Caesar actually sung by a countertenor, which is how I first did it, actually, was remarkable. Though I'd be perfectly happy to have Janet Baker sing a Julius Caesar or Joyce DiDonato or Sarah Connolly or any of those amazing women. It's also nice to find that there are men who can do that too, and the rest, because there's, you know, there was these great roles written for these men. And so I think that the combination of that and actually finding the right sound instrumentally, which also affected finding the right sound vocally. And suddenly Handel was everywhere, as you say. now you can barely open look at any opera house's season, and there's probably a Handel opera in there somewhere. It's great.
Do you have a favorite of the Handel operas that you've worked on?
Well, Giulio Cesare has to be at the top, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It is completely remarkable. It's completely wonderful. And he spent a lot of time in it. I mean, a lot of his operas, he would tend to write 2 every summer in preparation. Once he was running these opera companies in London, he would just write 2 operas every year, and they'd be put on in the coming year. And he wrote them quite quickly, actually, 3-4 weeks each, and they're done. Whereas with Caesar, he took immense trouble over it, and a lot of writing and rewriting, and it's very long and it's very complex, and it's all the roles are fabulous. I mean, there are no small roles in Giulio Cesare, you know, and there are no. It's like they're saying there are. Sorry, you're getting these pings.
For me?
I'm getting messages. I do apologize for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there are no small roles in Shakespeare, really. And it's interesting that Julius Caesar, though by no means related to the Shakespeare Julius Caesar, is also on a sort of Shakespearean theme. And they're just great roles, all of them. But you know, I'm about to do Xerxes for the first time. Can you believe I've not done it? I'm so excited. I'm doing it in Detroit next season, and that, of course, is. I've had my eye on it for years, hoping it would come my way, because it's sort of not just an opera seria. Some of it's very, very funny.
Yes.
And it's such an unusual piece, you know, starting as it does with, well, what everybody now calls Handel's Largo, but that is basically an aria to a plane tree. I mean, how do you, how wacky is that?
And it's also, I mean, the first time I saw it, I thought this is a big jump, but it reminds me of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma, that starts with just one voice singing. And that's, in other words, it ignores the whole option for pageantry and filling the stage with lots and lots of busy stuff. It focuses on one person's interior life. And like Oklahoma, it's about connecting to nature.
Very nice, F. Paul. Very nice.
There
Have
you
they
have
asked you to write the program now?
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, which comes not so much from Mozart, but for Handel, when you have these wonderful works that are written however fast or slowly, and now most of them are done in 21st century parlance with cuts. How do you decide what's a viable cut, what's not a viable? I mean, we all know that Marcellino's aria usually gets excised in Figaro.
More's the pity. More's the pity, in my view. I love Marcellino's aria because I think it rounds off the character wonderfully.
Absolutely.
But I agree. I've only ever done it once, I think, in all the Figaros I've ever done. I think only one production has had it. And in a sense, you know, like the Basilio aria, I've never done. And not much of a loss, actually. But you know, at that stage of you know, you've been at it for some time, and sort of the last people you really want to know about at that point are Marcellino and Basilio. Certainly Basilio. Marcellino is much more important, but you know, you want to know whether the Count's going to get away with it, and so on. No, cutting Handel is always awful, and the same with the oratorios, which I do a lot, you know, and those are huge, and you have to make cuts. In this day and age, you do, and I hate it. And with the operas, very, very occasionally, I'm reduced to cutting da capos, which I hate to do because I think that's sort of brutal, actually.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, does the B section add a great deal? I mean, you know, yes, it does, but can we do without it? Possibly. You know, it's if you're looking at cutting. I remember doing Ariodante at City Opera, with John Copley 15 or 20 years ago. Great cast, Sarah Connolly in her New York debut, I think. And we were suddenly told by the management that we had to get the whole lot under 3 hours, including interval, which with all Handel's operas, they're at least 3.5 hours. So we had to be brutal. And John and I went out to lunch and went through character by character, who can lose what, and to be even-handed about it too, because, and you just feel like a butcher, chopping off limbs, but it can be done, and try and retain, obviously, the narrative thrust and the dramatic energy and the emotional surges, but perhaps chopping away some of the some of the more, what's the word I want? The commenting arias rather than the crucial ones. I don't know. It's awful. It's hard, but you have to do it. And of course there are cuts you can make in recitative, which I also hate to do, particularly in Handel and Mozart, because nobody writes better recitative than they do. If you're cutting Haydn recitative, go for it. And he's good. There are other people who are much, much worse than that. No, I don't think Rossini's recitative is very good, actually. But with Mozart and completely with Mozart, but quite apart from anything else, the harmonic energy tells you so much.
Oh yes.
And if you start sort of cutting around with that, you've had it. But also the word setting, even if it's syllabic, you just know what you're just learning so much. And the same with Handel. I mean, he's just very, very good at it. And I hate to take even a semiquaver or a 16th note away.
In his day, in the 18th century, did people expect that kind of length? I mean,
oh yeah, absolutely, and more. I mean, if you think of his, we're talking about Handel now. If you think of his oratorios, some of which are 3.5 hours long, and then just for good measure, he'd throw a couple of organ concertos in as well for the interval. I mean, he'd be there for a long time, and with this, and by the way, he played the organ concertos himself, and they're fabulous. Yeah. So you wouldn't want to leave the theatre at all, miss any of it.
Well, speaking of not wanting to leave, I don't want to leave this conversation, but I'm going to have to, because that's all we have time for. But thank you so much. This has been delightful as always, and I can't wait to be in the same time zone and the same space with you again, sooner rather than later. But all success to you with your other work with Music of the Baroque and every place else. This is F. Paul Driscoll for Sightlines Opera News with my friend Dame Jane Glover. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you.